Greetings and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. There's a variety of ways that you can listen to the Truth Be Told Network. It is available as a podcast. So if you want to go to Audible or a couple different, podcast platforms like that, you can find God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, as well as many other great shows also on TBTRN. But you can also go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, which is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. Plus, you can definitely make use of your smart devices. That includes your phone, obviously, but then also your Alexa or your Google or your Apple, HomePod smart devices. And all you have to do is say, hey, Alexa, or whatever the case may be, listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network. And there's a variety of apps that you can use to make that happen for you. But regardless of how you listen, we are really thankful that you've decided to join us on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, and me specifically for my show, God Save the King. God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the Nativity story the way it really would have happened. And that is because, frankly, don't mean to hurt people's feelings here, that is because the traditional Nativity story is in fact Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance to what really would have happened. Now, a lot of the broad strokes remain the same. We have talked about this many times on this show. The fact that, Joseph and Mary definitely traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. No question about that. The shepherds definitely found a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. The young child, Jesus, and his parents were visited by these very intriguing wise men from the east. And we also know that Herod tried to kill the young child Jesus, and therefore Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt until Herod was dead, and then returned initially to Judea, and then they went to Nazareth, right? So as I was preparing for today's show, I was asking myself, well, okay, what are we going to talk about today? Because, man, a caveat that I need to make, there's several fundamental concepts that God Save the King is based upon, and we've covered these at length on other shows, and I'll cover them briefly here again now. Number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th, okay? And once you change the date, that also starts to change the circumstances, because frankly, we think we know what we know about the Nativity predominantly from what we would call Christmas-related resources. I was looking at yet another website earlier today, a website I've never seen before, and here's this article up on the website saying that a certain author was about to ruin Christmas, right? And I knew what he was, from that title, I knew exactly what they were driving at, that they were going to, debunk the notion that Jesus was born on December 25th and that, maybe it doesn't look exactly like we think it did, right? So I only read the first couple of paragraphs because that was all the more I had time for at the moment. But, I read the first couple of paragraphs and I was right. That's exactly what they were going to talk about, is they were going to debunk the notion that Jesus was born on December 25th. But one thing I took notice of was that nonetheless, even though they were going after the December 25th birth date, and they were going after the fact that it wasn't going to look quite like we are used to according to the traditional nativity story, they still called the Nativity the first Christmas. The first Christmas. And that is really unfair. That's really, really, really unfair, because it's not the first Christmas. Christmas is a word that developed much later, okay? It was not what it was called initially. The Jews certainly never would have called it Christmas, talking about the nativity or the birth of their Messiah, the Mashiach Nagid. The Jews never would have called it that. And even in Jesus's earthly ministry, if his birth date was discussed at all between him and his disciples, right? And especially the disciples that became the writers of the New Testament, right? We hardly see anything apart from the two infancy narratives in Matthew and in Luke. We hardly read anything about the birth of Jesus Christ. We are told in a very factual manner, okay? We are told in a very factual manner by Matthew and Luke, okay, this is what happened, right? But we're not told the date. We have to figure that out by cross-referencing other information in Scripture, and that's how we decipher the fact that he wasn't born on December 25th. But my point here is that calling it the first Christmas is reverse engineering, okay? It is leaping forward in time, reaching an erroneous conclusion that actually is not correct, and then looking backwards through that looking glass, through that viewfinder, and therefore calling the birth of Christ or the Nativity the first Christmas. And that just simply isn't accurate. But at any rate, when you correct the fact that Jesus was not born on December 25th, the story begins to change because you're removing it from the quote unquote Christmas related resources that we tend to turn to first when we want to understand the Nativity. When we want to understand the Nativity, we go to these Christmas related resources and we allow them to instruct us, and they're just not really all that accurate. So number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th. And when you change that, when you find the correct date, which is knowable from Scripture and astronomy, okay, then the story begins to change immediately, okay? And then fundamental premise number two that all of God Save the King is based upon is that tradition is not evidence, okay? Evidence is evidence. Tradition isn't evidence. Simply because you have a lot of people who have believed that Jesus wasn't born on December 25th for a long time, hundreds, if not thousands of years, that doesn't make it accurate. Tradition is not evidence. Fundamental premise number three, which is where we're going to land today, we're going to talk a lot about this today, is that the traditional versions of the Nativity story rarely include the historical context. I mean, they'll make a very brief mention, maybe of Herod, of course, because of the slaughter of the innocents, and maybe very briefly of Augustus Caesar, because we are told in the Gospel of Luke that in the days of Herod the king, there went out a decree from Augustus Caesar that all the world should be registered, the entire Roman Empire should be registered, right? So Augustus is mentioned, but that's about it, right? But we rarely put this in its true historical context. Who was Herod? What was he like, right? And he was the client king of the Romans. Okay, so in many ways, Judea was what was called a client kingdom. It wasn't a Roman province yet. Okay, so it would become a Roman province after Herod's death, but it wasn't a Roman province yet, although it was administrated by Herod for the Romans. So what does that mean? What does that look like? And I'll touch upon a couple of those factors today. I gain new information about this all the time. As I mentioned earlier, this is an ongoing research project. So even though I've never really put it down in writing, if you go to my website and things like that, I shouldn't neglect to mention the fact that there is a huge disclaimer that I make with regard to this work, which is that I reserve the right to change my mind. I reserve the right that if and when I learn something new, that I am able to say, whoa, wait a second, that makes way more sense than what we knew before. This is it. This has got to be what happens. So I always reserve the right to change my mind. And frankly, that is what good research and good science should be like. Okay. And good history for that matter. Frankly, even good theology needs to be like that. If it's funny, I make the statement when we did the television show a few years ago, Mike and I were talking about the fact that we really focus in on the history and not on the theology. But by focusing in on the history, this makes room for and opens doors for theological conversations, right? And there should be, and we're going to talk theology today, right? You can't talk about the history of Israel and not include the theology, right? So we are going to talk about that today. But what I was just driving at is that good research, and it doesn't matter what field it is in, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's in the field of biology or chemistry or physics or history or archaeology or theology. Good research means things change. It means you learn new things over time, right? So, we all know for the past couple of years, there's been all this hubbub in the news about follow the science, right? Well, and the science is determined, right? Well, sometimes science does work that way. There are certain things that science has proven to be true and that aren't going to change, right? It's like if you combine two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, you're going to get water every time, okay? I don't think that's one of the things that's going to change. But there are other things that even when we claim that they are science, and I'm doing air quotes for those of you who can't see me, right? Even when we are talking about science, we learned things 10, 15, 50, 100, 200, 500, 1,000 years later that changes our perspective. I mean, in God Save the King, we talk a lot about astronomy, right? We use astronomy to help pinpoint the dates that a lot of things happen, right? Well, and even though that remains extremely accurate, the fact that we are able to use computers today and wind the clock backwards, so to speak, and be able to see what the stars look like on certain days and certain dates and go, aha, we really believe that this happened on this date because we can see a configuration in the sky, in the night sky, that looks like this, and we believe that that's either what the Magi saw or it's what John the Apostle testifies to in the book of Revelation, or whatever the case may be. But the Mesopotamian celestial observers, that what eventually became to be called the Magi, right? They had an almost exclusively two-dimensional understanding of the skies. They did not initially understand that what they were looking at was three-dimensional. They thought it was as if there were a backdrop, right? And that on that backdrop were these points of light, and that they moved on a skein, so to speak, in a way. And then over time is when they realized, oh no, wait a second, this is three-dimensional. And then that changes it. That changes your perspective, right? Also, they weren't initially heliocentric, right? They didn't believe that our solar system, which they didn't even understand the concept of a solar system, let alone a galaxy or multiple galaxies, right? But they believed that the points of light that they saw were centered around the Earth, right? Not around the sun. That's something that came later, was realizing that our solar system is heliocentric and based around the sun. So these are just some very quick examples of how the science changes. When we learn new things, the science changes. And I learn new stuff about God Save the King all the time, which is why this will never be exhausted, I'm sure. I've been doing this for 35 years already, and I doubt that, I doubt, that's not even the right way to say it. I know that I will never exhaust this material. I will continually be learning more about what the birth of Christ really looked like in its biblical context, in its historical context, and in its theological context. And that's why tonight's episode, or today's show, is entitled Context, 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 because that's a play on that old real estate joke. What are the three most important things in real estate? And it's location, location, location. Well, the three most important things when it comes to historical research is context, 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 because you just can't understand this stuff without putting it in its context. It's historical context, it's biblical context, it's theological context. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. Probably going to repeat some things that we've talked about before, but I want to put some of these pieces together in a little bit more of a macro way to help people understand the context. Frankly, that's really what I'm driving at, is to help understand the context. And I want to go all the way back to Abraham for a second. Actually, we're going to go back further than that in a moment, very briefly. But let's start with Abraham, because that's a great starting point. We know the story of Abraham, that God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, and that he made an agreement, an arrangement, a contract, a covenant with Abraham, and said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to put you in a land of my choosing, and then I am going to bless you. And then the reason I am phrasing it that way is because the promises that God makes to Abraham can be broken down into three very convenient categories. And those three categories are the land, number one, the seed or his descendants, number two, and then number three, the blessing. Okay. Now, each of these categories could have additional labels attached to it. Now, the land, that one, not so much. The land clause or the land category of the Abrahamic covenant, that's pretty much the land, right? There's really not a better label to slap on it. I have mentioned before that in academic circles, it is sometimes referred to as the Palestinian Covenant, and I really do not like that label because of where the word Palestine came from. Palestine is the English version of the Latin word Palestina, which is the Latin version of the word Philistine. And when the Romans put down the second Jewish revolt in 135 BC, they deliberately renamed Judea Palestine in a deliberate effort to offend the Jews by naming it after their traditional enemies. So I do not like ever giving that word credibility and ever calling the land of Canaan or the promised land or Judea or Israel, ever calling it Palestine. Okay. And we're going to see that tonight again as well, that in some recent research, I was looking at some different city names and I'm going, well, where's that city name? Where's that? I don't know where that is. And I go look it up on a map and I discover, oh, well, that's because Herod changed the name of a traditional Jewish city, right? And he changed the name of it to honor the Romans, which is why I didn't know where it was, because I was assuming it had its traditional Jewish name. And I mean, and it's all over the place. As a matter of fact, since I tripped into it, let's go there for a second, okay? We'll bunny trail off of Abraham. Let's see if I get back there, because as I was planning for tonight's show, there's just so many ideas, so many cool things I could share. There's so many ideas banging around in my head. I'm like, God, what am I going to share? Well, I figured, well, you know what? I'll just start talking and we'll see where we go. Right. So, some stuff that I've learned lately, just some little details. Right. So the example I just gave you, right. The city of Sebastia, right. Sebaste or Sebastia, Sebast or Sebastia, right? That is a Greek word, and it's a Greek word that means venerated, okay? And it is, on occasion, it is the Greek translation of the Latin word Augustus, okay? And Augustus is simply, technically it's an adjective, right? It is a Latin adjective that means magnificent, right? It's technically not a name. Caesar Augustus isn't his name. It means the magnificent Caesar, right? The august, the magnificent Caesar, right? And it was an honor that was bestowed upon Octavian, right? That's really the man's name. The man's name was Octavian. And then when he was declared, it wasn't even his family name, right? He was the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, and for him that was actually his name. Caesar was actually his name, but then Octavian was Caesar's great nephew, forget off the top of my head, But then when Julius Caesar declared Octavian to be his heir, that's when, and then Julius Caesar was murdered, Octavian took the name Caesar, right? And then later he added the label, the title Augustus, right? Meaning magnificent, right? But at any rate, there's my phone. Sorry, guys. See if I can get that away from the microphone. The city of Sebastia, right, is the Greek name for the Latin word Augustus, but it's the city of Samaria. Okay, Herod renamed it in order to honor Caesar. See, and this is common in this part of the world, right? So here's another one. I've been doing a lot of research into the minor client kingdoms that were to the north of Israel, because they play a role in our story. I've been doing a lot of research lately into the route that the Magi would have followed in order to go to Judea and Jerusalem from the heart of Mesopotamia, which is where I believe they primarily came from. Not necessarily exclusively, mind you, but primarily I believe that the Parthian Magi came from the heart of Mesopotamia, from the Parthian cities of Babylon and Ctesiphon, right? But there also may have been Magi that joined in from Nineveh and from other cities within the Parthian Empire, and then possibly even locations outside of the Parthian Empire. But regardless, because of the trade routes that existed at that time, they would not have just headed out straight across the desert. You just didn't do that, right? So they would have followed the established trade routes northwest along the Euphrates River until they got to northern Mesopotamia, right? And this is, here we go. So we're back to Abraham for a different reason, but we're back to Abraham. When Abraham was told to leave Ur of the Chaldees and go to the land of Canaan, because his father Terah was told to go to Canaan, right? On one hand, he was told, get you up and go to a place that I will show you, but also at the same time, when you read the record in Genesis 11, okay, where it appears that God maybe even spoke to Terah first, maybe, it's kind of hard to say. That's where we're initially told, go to Canaan, right? Well, they didn't, I mean, Canaan and Ur, as far as latitude is concerned, are not really all that significantly different. He could have just bugged out due west, but that would have taken him straight across the Arabian desert. You wouldn't do that, right? Why would you do that? You would follow the established trade routes. You would follow the roads, because for a journey such as this, you would need food and water. You wouldn't just collect up all your own food and water on your own. You'd want to be able to acquire it along the way, whether that meant traveling along the river so that you would have access to water, right? Traveling on trade routes so you'd have access to maybe towns for food and things like that. You would definitely travel that way. Well, Abraham went all the way to Haran. Now, Haran is in way northern Mesopotamia. He, frankly, sure appears like he went out of the way. There comes a point on that northwest trek as you're going northwest along the Euphrates where you can, frankly, hang a left and cut off some time. You don't have to go all the way to Haran to make that happen, right? But apparently he did, right? So now when we're considering the route that the Magi took, did they go way north? Well, I can guarantee you they didn't go all the way to Haran. One of the primary crossings of the Euphrates was at a city called Rasapha. We would call it Rasapha today, right? Or Al Rasaf, I believe, is the modern name, and it's Rezeph in the book of Isaiah, right? And it has been a crossing of the Euphrates for centuries, millennia, right? Millennia, right? And so that's a very likely location. But there were a couple of shortcuts. There were a couple of shortcuts across the desert, and it's becoming increasingly possible that I think the Magi took one of these roots instead, right? But at any rate, the reason I bring this up is because these kingdoms and regions and countries and cities to the north of Israel, especially when you get up to that corner of the Mediterranean Sea, between the Mediterranean and the Euphrates, right? It would be the eastern end of Asia Minor, right? What we would call modern day Turkey today. And then it would be also in the modern country of Syria, right? And then modern Armenia and things like that. It's that corner right up in the corner of the Mediterranean Sea, between the Mediterranean and the Euphrates. That region of the world was really critical, okay? Really critical to the background of our story and to the story itself, because that would have been where the predominant Roman presence would have been during our story. Now, later, the Romans actually occupied Judea, right? Because you heard me say earlier, pardon me, that under Herod, Judea was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire, not a Roman province. Then later, when Herod died and his son Archelaus became the quote-unquote king of Judea, he didn't do a very good job, and Augustus deposed him really only about maximum of 10 years into his reign. Realistically, it was more like 6 or 7 years into his reign. Augustus deposed Archelaus, and that's when they installed a Roman governor of Judea, and Judea became a Roman province. Okay, but up until then, it was a client kingdom administrated for Rome by Herod the Great. Okay, but so like I said, is that the Roman presence during Herod's day would have been significantly to the north. Okay, even Damascus, the city of Damascus, was administrated for the Romans by Herod. So you probably did, even though it was a thoroughly Roman city, it was a thoroughly Romanized city. Okay, because when they revamped the whole city according to their methodology, they deliberately made cities look a certain way, frankly, for the legions, right? For the Roman legions to be able to operate. And so when you get up in the area of Damascus and then Antioch, and once again in that corner of the Mediterranean, that was what was called Roman Syria, the Roman province of Syria. Once again, that corner of the Mediterranean, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Euphrates, and therefore also the trade routes that would have went to the east at that point. That was where the Romans were really, really focused, because it was strategically extremely important, right? So if you go all the way back in the Bible to the descendants of Noah, okay, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, we learn that one of the sons of Shem was a man named Aram, or Aram, right? Aram, right? And this was his territory. His territory was in extreme northern Mesopotamia, but actually not Mesopotamia, because he was on the other side of the Euphrates, okay? The other side of the Euphrates. And over time, so his descendants became known as the Aramaeans, 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 right? So his descendants were the Aramaeans, and the language they spoke was a Semitic language, because that's Shem, right? Shem and the Shemites, the Semites, right? All the descendants of Shem are Semites, right? So it's a Semitic language, but the descendants of Aram, or Aram, spoke Aramaic, right? So we've all heard that before too, because eventually Aramaic became the lingua franca of that region, when the lingua franca was not either like Greek, okay? It was definitely Greek because of the Greek influence, but apart from the Greek influence, the lingua franca would have been Aramaic in that area, right? But my point here is that you've got the biblical label, okay, would be that Aram or Aram was a son of Shem. His descendants were the Arameans, and they spoke Aramaic. Well, when the Greeks came in, hundreds and hundreds of years later, when the Greeks came in, they deliberately started calling that region Syria. Okay. Well, why? Well, because they demanded that their culture be followed, right? And what the Greeks were doing is they were making a distinction between Assyria, which was east of the Euphrates, and Syria, which was west of the Euphrates. But then that label stuck, right? See, so we would call that region Syria to this day, instead of going back to using the biblical label that we would learn from the Bible, which is that would have been Aramea. Okay, that region would have been called Aramea. But it's just really interesting to note that these changes occurred over time, and oftentimes they were done as a deliberate insult to the biblical people and the peoples of God. I mean, deliberately designed to change the name and change the culture and remove the identity, right? Remove the identity. And as I kind of hinted at earlier, God Save the King is predominantly about the history and not about the theology. But there comes a point when you've got to talk about the theology, right? So let's go back to Abraham for a second, because I just feel inspired to talk about this tonight, okay? So go back to Abraham and go back to the covenant that God made with Abraham. That covenant can be divided into three very convenient categories: the seed, the land, and the blessing. Okay. And then, like I started to say, each of those three categories, you could use additional labels. For the land clause or the land category, you pretty much got to call it the land, right? But the seed, you could also say the descendants or the nation. Okay. The nation clause or the descendant clause, or frankly, the people clause, right? And then finally, you could talk about the blessing clause, but you could also call the blessing clause the promise clause, or you could call it the covenant clause, right? So seed, land, blessing, or you could go people, land, promise, right? You could use these categories to describe these labels to describe these categories. But part of the reason I want to bring it up is because this isn't the first time these concepts came up. All right. Let me say one thing and then I'll jump back there. So then after Abraham, God makes three additional unconditional covenants with the nation of Israel, each one of which is an amplification of one of these categories. I'm taking the Mosaic covenant and setting it aside for a moment. That's a different category for a different day and a different time. But after the Abrahamic covenant, God made a covenant with the nation of Israel, with Moses acting as Israel's representative, right? And this is the land covenant, right? The one that I mentioned already that scholars like to call it the Palestinian covenant, the land covenant. And it's all in Deuteronomy, and it amplifies the land clause of the Abrahamic covenant. Then you get the seed clause. That's in a covenant called the Davidic covenant. And then you get the promise clause, which is in a covenant called the New Covenant, right? And that's prophesied by Jeremiah and Ezekiel in particular. And then that covenant is ratified between God and the nation of Israel, with Jesus acting as the mediator and the apostles, the disciples, acting as the representatives of the nation of Israel, right? But these three categories actually go back earlier, and they will extend further. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go back to Genesis chapter 1 and read Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, and just look for these equivalent concepts, you will find them, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, there's the land. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's the land. There you go, right? And then he separates the waters above the firmament from the waters below the firmament. And then he separates the dry land from the waters, right? And then what does he do after he separates the water and the dry land? Well, he starts creating living things. Well, there's the seed, and we are told that everything brought forth after its own kind, right? So now you've got plants and animals all reproducing after their own seed, right? So now you got the land and then you got the seed. See, and God said, and every time another day went by, God said it was good. Well, there's the blessing. He's blessing his creation, seed, land, blessing, right? And then, of course, he creates Adam and Eve, right? And he gets done creating Adam and Eve. And the first thing, I should have the reference in front of me, but I don't. The very first thing he does after he's finally completed his creation is it says, and God blessed them, right? And God blessed them, right? So this seed land blessing thing goes all the way back to Genesis. And it was occurring to me as I was doing my show prep that I got a sneaking suspicion it goes back further than that. And you're going, well, gee, Tim, how's that possible? Isn't Genesis 1 isn't that the beginning? Well, what about the beginning, right? What about before God created anything? Because Scripture records a covenant cut by the members of the Godhead in eternity past before they ever created anything, right? And the whole purpose of the everlasting covenant, that's what it's called in theological circles, is that the members of the Godhead desired to expand the fellowship of the Godhead to create their ezer kenegdo, right? When we get to the story of Adam and Eve and God creating the perfect companion for Adam, okay, we are meant to actually look backwards at that and look backwards at the creation and realize that what God was doing was creating the perfect companion for himself, right? So you have an invisible God creating a visible creation, right? You have a celestial God who lives in the heavens creating a terrestrial being to inhabit, right? You have God creating the heavens and the earth, right? The land. So there's the land. See, his intention was always land and seed, and then for his creation to live by his divine life. So land, seed, and blessing it's from before creation. It's from before the foundation of the world. And that is how you find the everlasting covenant, by the way, is do a word study of the phrase from before the foundation of the world, or the equivalents thereof. Okay, if you run those down, you will find all of these different things that occurred, quote unquote, before the foundation of the world. And when you take those things and put them all together, you discovered that the members of the Godhead cut a covenant in eternity past before the foundation of the world, before they created anything, right? And everything they determined to create was connected to the notion of seed, land, and blessing, right? So it's no surprise that we would find that in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 when they created. It's no surprise that we see Adam and Eve cast out of the land, so to speak, right? And I won't go there. Been doing a lot of research on the concept of the wilderness, right? Right? Well, if Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, where did they go? Well, I think they went into the wilderness, right? And although the wilderness is certainly a type of land, it's not the right land, right? And when you jump forward to Abraham, right, back to Abraham now, and we talk about the seed, the land, and the blessing, remember I said you could call it the seed, the land, and the promise, right? Well, it's the promised land, and then the promised seed, and then the promised blessing. It's the promised land. Well, that's where we get that word from. Is where we get that phrase from is when God promised land to Abraham, right? All right, I want to make sure that my computer's working good. My computer just did something funny there, so I wanted to make sure it was running properly. It looks fine. Okay, anyway, so We see seed, land, and blessing in the everlasting covenant. We see seed, land, and blessing in creation. We see seed, land, and blessing in the Abrahamic covenant, right? And then, just to take it another step further, we see it in the new covenant, in the New Testament that we partake of, that we take part of. Okay. Now, remember, I've mentioned this before, that the new covenant was not cut between God and the church. Okay. The new covenant is a covenant God made with the nation of Israel as part of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Seed, land, blessing, and the blessing ultimately would be that God would indwell the nation of Israel and live among them as their God. Okay, that's the ultimate fulfillment of it right there. But we know what happened. The Israelites, the Jews, they denied their Messiah, right? And then you have the whole death, resurrection, ascension thing. Now, those of us who follow Christ as the Messiah of Israel, after the fact, so to speak, we get to take part or partake of the new covenant that God made with Israel, right? And therefore we get seed, land, and blessing as well. It's just that we are, quote unquote, born again of incorruptible seed. Okay. And the land that we get is that we are seated in the heavenlies. And then the blessing that we get, that we've already gotten, okay, is that we are indwelt by the Holy Spirit, right? So this theme runs from eternity to eternity throughout the Bible. So to help put it in context for God Save the King, this is the focus, right, of what is going on with the Nativity. When Jesus comes into the earthly realm, right? And here you go. Let's go there for a sec, right? Anybody who's ever gotten a quote unquote Christmas card, okay, probably got a Christmas card that quotes the prophet Micah, right? Reasonably certain, I'd have to look it up, reasonably certain off the top of my head, it's chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, I think. Isn't that it? Where it says, "Thou Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be least among the princes of Judah, yet from thee shall come he who is to save my people Israel." And then it says, "whose goings forth have been from everlasting." Whose goings forth have been from everlasting. The everlasting one was going to come into the material realm and save Israel. The Mashiach Nagid. That's the Nativity. That's the purpose of the second person of the Godhead coming into the material realm. Okay, that's the purpose, and that happened at the Nativity, is when Jesus of Nazareth was born. Okay, so it was all done as partial fulfillment of these conditions that were set forth in the Abrahamic covenant, right? The Davidic covenant, which is an expansion of the Abrahamic covenant, all talks about the promised seed. And the promised seed, quite clearly, by the way, is not just the nation of Israel, and it's not the descendants of Abraham by faith, which is the church. The promised seed is the Messiah. It is the Mashiach Nagid, which is interesting because, what we talked about a minute ago, that's promised to Eve, right? Adam and Eve get that promise, right? Your seed will bruise the serpent's head. See, so there you have promised seed all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, right? So Jesus coming into the world was absolutely a fulfillment of the seed clause, a fulfillment, not the fulfillment, a fulfillment of the seed clause of the Abrahamic covenant, right? And then I'm going to fast forward for a second. When you get to Jesus's earthly ministry, right? You have the apostles asking him, they're continually asking him, you know, and because what they're looking for is they're looking for the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, the seed, the land, and the blessing, and the Messiah is here. So they're continually asking him, isn't this it? Isn't this it? Right? And yet Jesus is also continually speaking to them and indicating to them and showing them that there's a different component of this that is equally as true, that is also part of what's going on, which is the kingdom of heaven. But the kingdom of heaven is an internal kingdom. It's not an external kingdom. They keep looking for the kingdom of Israel, right? Which they know is promised in these covenants. They're not wrong about that. They're not wrong. These things are promised in the covenants made to Abraham. They're looking for a physical kingdom, a physical, earthly, territorial, geopolitical kingdom with a king, right? That's what they're looking for. And they are not entirely wrong to expect it. It's just that Jesus throws them a curveball and says, yeah, that's not it. That's not everything. That's not the whole story, right? And I'm here to bring you the whole story, right? And only some people had eyes to see and ears to hear with regard to, quote unquote, the whole story, right? But this is critical in understanding the Nativity, because this is, here we go, this is the context of the Nativity. These promises made to Abraham. And then all through the Old Testament, you had the nation of Israel. You had a hereditary monarchy. Okay, after you get, once they go from the wilderness wanderings and then into the promised land and the period of Judges, and then finally they get a king, right? They finally get a king, Saul, and then David, and then descended from there, right? So they have a hereditary monarchy, but they also have a hereditary priesthood, right? The descendants of Levi and of Aaron are an hereditary priesthood. So you've got a hereditary royal line, then you've monarchy, then you have a hereditary priesthood, right? But then you have these captivities, right? The Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities, and these throw all of that just into turmoil, right? Because eventually the Jews are allowed to return, right? When the Persians conquer the Babylonians, they release the Jews and allow them to go back to their homeland, right? But they allow them to go back and they allow them to reestablish the hereditary priesthood, but they don't allow them to go back and establish the hereditary monarchy. Think about that. And there's good reason for it, because if it's a vassal kingdom, right? Why would you ever allow a legitimate king, right? I mean, you might allow a vassal king, right? But why would you, right? Especially what they did, of course, is that means once the Jews returned to Canaan from the captivity, that meant that the high priest kind of effectively became the king, so to speak, right? And the high priests and the leadership of the Jews, beginning from the release from captivity all the way up through Herod and the Romans, right? I mean, they were vassals. They were slaves to a foreign power. First the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, right? And this is, once again, so this is the context of the Nativity and the context of God Save the King. See, God Save the King, right? Where is the king? Where is the king? We got a high priest, and he's kind of like a king, but not really, right? So even when you get to the middle of the 2nd century BC, and you have the Hasmonean revolt, the Maccabean revolt against the the Seleucid Empire, which are, here you go, Syrian Greeks, right? From that part of the map that I was talking about, that's where they're from, right? They were particularly cruel to the Jews that lived in the promised land. And by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Jews had just had a belly full of it and engaged in open revolt and threw off the hegemony of the Seleucid Empire and established an independent kingdom under the Maccabees. But take note, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, they were from a priestly family. They were not, they became known, quote unquote, as Judean royalty. They became de facto Judean royalty. That's how they operated, but that isn't what they were. They were not from the royal tribe of Judah, right? So even when the Hasmoneans were running the country, and so you had a couple of different things going on, right? Is on one hand, you clearly had the Jewish citizenry going, oh, fabulous. This is great. Okay, so maybe they're not from the royal tribe, the legitimate royal tribe, but at least they're Jews. Okay, at least we're not under foreign dominion anymore. At least we're running our own country, right? So that would have been one attitude that they would have had. But then the other attitude would have been, well, but wait a second. They're not legitimate. That can't be right. Wait a second. Where's the real king? God save the king. God save the king. Where's the real king? Where's the real guy, right? And that makes us think of, obviously, when the Magi showed up and said, where is he who is born king of the Jews? I mean, because Herod was not even Jewish, right? So he didn't even have Jewish blood, let alone the correct tribe. At least the Hasmoneans were Jewish, even if they were from the wrong tribe. But this is just this recurring theme over and over and over and over again. And it starts from, number one, from before the foundation of the world. And then we see it again at the creation. And then we see it again at the Abrahamic covenant, that God is promising his people a seed, a land, and a blessing, and a huge, significant portion of that promised, of the promises, is the promised seed, the Messiah, the King, right? So this is the context of the Nativity. This is the context of God Save the King, is that, where is he? Where is he? Right? Where is he? Israel has been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting they thought they had it, right? Under David, right? Under David, and then again under Solomon, right? Israel was at the peak of their power. No question about it. They had the largest area of land at that time. They were very influential. They were militarily powerful at that time. But then it just all started going downhill. Once you get to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, that's when the kingdom divides, right? That's no good, right? And then you have the captivities. And then, you got the release from captivity, and the people of Israel come back, but they never got to restore, that royal line, the king. Where is the king? Where is the king? So we're going to wrap it up here pretty much, because it's a good spot to wrap it up in, because that is the context of God Save the King. God Save the King is about the coming into the material realm of the second person of the Godhead, Jesus of Nazareth, but he is the Messiah, the King of Israel. And in the context of our story, this is what the people were looking for, hoping for, waiting for, because this is what God had promised them. This was the promised seed, the Messiah of Israel. So I hope you enjoyed today's show. It was a little bit, off the cuff and just going with whatever, came to me in the moment, hopefully led by the Holy Spirit. But I really want to thank you for joining me today. My name is Tim Keyes. I am the host of God Save the King. I look forward to seeing you every Friday night at 10 p.m. on the Truth Be Told radio network. God Save the King.